Benedict Arnold became America's most famous traitor because he had first been one of its most useful heroes. That is the uncomfortable part of the record. His name did not become a synonym for betrayal because he was an outsider, a minor schemer, or a man no one had trusted. It became darker because the trust had been real. Before West Point, before invisible ink, before coded lines hidden inside ordinary letters, Arnold had stood in the center of some of the Revolutionary War's most demanding military episodes. He helped seize Fort Ticonderoga. He led men through the Kennebec River route and the Maine wilderness toward Quebec. He was wounded in the failed assault on Quebec City. He built a fighting flotilla on Lake Champlain and delayed British operations from Canada near Valcour Island. At Saratoga, he helped direct American attacks at Bemis Heights and was severely wounded again, this time in the left leg near the Bremen fortified camp. Then, in 1780, while commanding West Point and its dependencies, he tried to deliver that strategic post into British hands. That is the contradiction at the center of this story. Not hero, then villain, as if one cleanly erased the other. Not a patriotic mask covering an empty man. The archive gives us something more difficult. A Continental officer whose service was substantial, whose body carried the evidence of battle, and whose later plot threatened one of the most important positions in the American war effort. The name Benedict Arnold survives in American English almost as a charge. To call someone a Benedict Arnold is to accuse them of betrayal. It is not a neutral reference to a historical figure. It is a verdict. But verdicts can flatten a life. They can make the ending seem inevitable, and they can turn a complicated record into a single crime scene. This series begins by resisting that flattening, not to excuse Arnold, but to understand the force of the betrayal. Because the treason only carries its full weight when placed beside the battlefield record. The first side of that record begins early in the war. On May 10, 1775, American forces captured British-held Fort Ticonderoga, with Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen involved in the seizure. The victory mattered beyond the drama of a fort changing hands. Ticonderoga held a major store of cannon, the kind of military material the American side badly needed at the beginning of the conflict. Arnold did not enter the revolution as a distant observer. He appeared near the opening edge of armed rebellion, connected to a practical and symbolic success. Then came the Quebec expedition of 1775, a campaign that reads almost like an endurance file. Arnold led an expedition toward Quebec by way of the Kennebec River and the Maine wilderness. The American Battlefield Trust describes the movement as carrying roughly 1,100 Continental soldiers across more than 300 miles of wilderness. This was not simply marching down a known road. It was river travel, portage, exhausted men, failing supplies, and the blunt geography of the northern interior. Arnold had arranged for Reuben Colburn to build 200 bateaux, each intended to row with 4 oars and to be supplied with paddles and setting poles. The details matter because they show the practical scale of the undertaking. This was a military operation built out of wood, water, muscle, and calculation. The Quebec campaign ended in failure. On December 31, 1775, American forces assaulted Quebec City. Richard Montgomery was killed. Arnold was severely wounded. But even failure could build reputation when failure was paid for in exposed courage. Arnold survived that assault, not as a defeated politician, but as an officer who had taken physical risks in the field. The next year, the pattern changed shape but not intensity. In 1776, Arnold constructed a flotilla on Lake Champlain and fought a British fleet near Valcour Island on October 11th. The action did not produce a simple American triumph in the usual sense, but it delayed British operations from Canada. Delay in war can be a weapon. A day, a season, a blocked route, a slowed advance, these can reshape a campaign. Arnold's service here was unusual because it moved from wilderness expedition to improvised naval resistance. He was not merely present. He was repeatedly attached to moments where the American cause needed time, material, or stubborn obstruction. Then came Saratoga. At Bemis Heights on October 7, 1777, Arnold helped direct American attacks against John Burgoyne's forces. The Battle of Bemis Heights produced a decisive American tactical victory. The National Park Service gives the losses as over 630 British casualties and about 150 American casualties. Near the Bremen fortified camp, Arnold was severely wounded in the left leg. 10 days later, on October 17th, Burgoyne's army surrendered at Saratoga. The National Park Service identifies that victory as important in convincing France to support American independence. So when we say Arnold later betrayed the American cause, we are speaking of a man linked to events that helped that cause survive. This is why the story is not just personal scandal. It is a crime and power story. Arnold's treason was not the act of an obscure outsider trying to become important through betrayal. It came from a celebrated major general trusted with West Point, one of the Revolution's most strategic posts. West Point guarded the Hudson River at a strategic S-curve, where currents, winds, and the bend made navigation difficult for ships. The defenses were not imaginary lines on a map. They included Fort Arnold, Fort Putnam, Fort Constitution on Constitution Island, batteries, redoubts, and the Great Chain stretched across the Hudson River. That chain is one of the hard objects in this archive. American Battlefield Trust describes its links as about 2 feet long and 114 pounds each, with a total span of about 600 yards and a weight of about 65 tons. The Museum of the American Revolution describes a 500-yard, about 65-ton chain. However one follows the measurements, the meaning is clear. West Point was infrastructure. It was a system of stone, iron, water, artillery, and terrain. Arnold was not merely offering the British a fort. He was offering them a designed defensive system on a river corridor that mattered to the war. The plot that formed around that offer moved through the tools of espionage. Arnold's communications with Major John André used invisible ink and coded writing embedded between the lines of ordinary-looking letters. Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England was used as a codebook. These are quiet mechanisms, ink that appears as nothing, messages hidden between harmless sentences, a law book turned into a cipher. They belong to a different Arnold than the officer at Quebec or Saratoga, but the documents join the same life. The collapse came when André was captured while returning toward British lines with documents related to West Point. Washington's General Orders of September 26, 1780, stated that Arnold, then commanding at West Point, had been about to deliver that important post into enemy hands and that Major John André was a prisoner. André was later hanged as a spy in October 1780. Arnold escaped to a British ship. After defecting, he served in the British Army and later led a British attack on New London, Connecticut in September 1781. The archive leaves us with a strange problem of memory. At Saratoga, the National Park Service's Boot Monument commemorates Arnold's battlefield service and wound without naming him. It remembers the leg, not the man. That silence is revealing. A monument can acknowledge the military fact while refusing the honor of the name. It is an object shaped by contradiction, service too important to erase, treason too severe to forgive. That contradiction will guide the chapters ahead. The battlefield record will not be treated as decoration before the crime, and the treason will not be treated as a footnote after the glory. They belong to the same historical file. Fort Ticonderoga, the Kennebec route, Quebec City, Valcour Island, Bemis Heights, Philadelphia, West Point, André, Invisible Ink, and the Great Chain are not disconnected scenes. They form the path by which a trusted officer became an American warning. But before the name hardened into an accusation, before West Point and the coded letters, there was a younger Benedict Arnold in Connecticut, born in Norwich, established in New Haven, known not yet as a traitor, but as a businessman, a militia captain, and a man positioned to rise when rebellion became war. The story begins to narrow now, away from the later machinery of treason and back toward Connecticut, where the public record first places Benedict Arnold before he became a Continental officer, before he became a wounded hero, and long before his name became an accusation. The confirmed outline is spare, but it matters. Benedict Arnold was born on January 14, 1741, in Norwich, Connecticut. When the American Revolution began, he was not an unknown drifter appearing suddenly at the edge of events. He was a successful businessman and a militia captain in New Haven, Connecticut. Those two locations, Norwich and New Haven, frame the first public shape of his life. One is the birthplace. The other is the base from which he entered the war. That may sound simple, almost administrative. But in a crime and power story, Administrative facts often explain how access becomes possible. Arnold's later betrayal would depend on trust, rank, correspondence, military geography, and the confidence of men who believed he could handle responsibility. That confidence did not appear from nowhere. Before the war made him famous, Arnold already stood in a world of trade, local reputation, and militia obligation. He had a place. He had a role. He had experience moving through systems where goods, credit, command, and authority mattered. Norwich, Connecticut gives us the beginning. It places Arnold in colonial New England before the imperial crisis became open rebellion. It is not necessary to decorate that beginning with invented scenes or private motives. The record does not require us to imagine the boy at the center of a destiny. It is enough to mark the date and place, January 14th, 1741, Norwich. From that fixed point, the later events become measurable. When Fort Ticonderoga fell in May of 1775, Arnold was not a teenager swept into a cause. He was a man in his 30s, already established enough to act quickly when military opportunity appeared. New Haven gives us the more immediate pre-war Arnold. By the outbreak of the American Revolution, he was a successful businessman there. That description is important because business in the 18th century Atlantic world was not a narrow private skill. It required judgment about supply, timing, risk, transport, and negotiation. We should not turn that into a personality sketch beyond the evidence. But we can say this much: the same public identity that made Arnold recognizable in New Haven also made his wartime rise more plausible. He was someone accustomed to practical affairs, accustomed to responsibility, and situated among people who could see him as more than an ordinary recruit. The second part of that identity was military. Arnold was a militia captain in New Haven when the Revolution began. The rank matters. A militia captain was not yet a Continental general, and it should not be mistaken for the later command structure that would carry Arnold through Canada, Lake Champlain, Saratoga, Philadelphia, and West Point. But it meant he had a recognized local command before the first dramatic episode of his revolutionary career. He entered the conflict already connected to military organization, however local its scale. He was not merely offering enthusiasm. He could present himself as a man with standing, with command experience, and with a claim to act. This is where the early file becomes quietly revealing. Arnold's later career can seem almost too abrupt if it begins only with famous battlefields. Fort Ticonderoga, the Kennebec River, Quebec City, Valcour Island, Bemis Heights. These are large scenes, and Arnold moves through them with striking speed. But the Connecticut background explains part of the transition. New Haven was not an incidental address. It was the setting in which he was both a businessman and militia captain at the moment rebellion turned into war. His rise did not begin as a mystery. It began from an existing public position. The archive-report approach asks us to resist two temptations at once. The first is to read the Traitor backward into every early fact, as if Norwich and New Haven must contain visible signs of West Point. The second is to treat the early hero as if the later betrayal can be suspended outside the record. Neither approach is useful. The safer method is to hold the facts in sequence. Arnold was born in Norwich. He became established in New Haven. At the beginning of the Revolution, he was both commercially successful and a militia captain. From that position, he moved rapidly toward military action. This distinction matters because Arnold's treason later shocked Americans not simply because betrayal occurred, but because of who committed it. A minor figure could defect and be condemned. Arnold's case became something larger because he had first been trusted with real responsibility and associated with real service. That trust had roots before the Continental Army knew him as a battlefield officer. Local standing was not the same as national fame, but it was a platform. It helped make possible the first step from town militia captain to revolutionary commander. In New Haven, the coming of war gave men like Arnold a new field in which local authority could be converted into military action. The American Revolution did not begin with a fully settled national army. It began with local committees, militia formations, provincial actions, and urgent decisions about British posts, arms, routes, and supplies. In that environment, a man who combined business experience with militia rank could move quickly. He could understand the practical side of conflict, that wars require more than speeches, They require weapons, food, boats, roads, money, and men willing to follow orders. Arnold's later campaigns would repeatedly expose that practical dimension. The march toward Quebec would depend on bateaux, river travel, portages, provisions, and the survival of men in wilderness conditions. The Lake Champlain campaign would require the construction of a flotilla. West Point would turn on fortifications, river obstacles, batteries, redoubts, and the strategic bend of the Hudson River. Those later chapters belong to later records, but the pre-war Arnold already stood at the intersection of commerce and command. That intersection does not explain everything. It does explain why he could be seen early as useful. There is also a quieter point about ambition. The chapter title calls him an ambitious militia captain, and ambition is one of the few terms that can be used here without pretending to read his private mind. Ambition in this context is visible in public movement. Arnold did not remain a local figure once war opened. He acted. He sought a role in events larger than New Haven. Soon, he would be connected with the seizure of a British-held fort at Ticonderoga, and his name would be linked with Ethan Allen in one of the Revolution's early successes. That movement from local command to dramatic action is the story's first acceleration. But before that acceleration, we should pause over the ordinary credibility Arnold carried into the crisis. A successful businessman in New Haven had networks. A militia captain had a recognized place in the local military order. A man born in Norwich and established in New Haven could be known within Connecticut before he was known by the Continental cause. These are not colorful details, but they are load-bearing ones. They show why Arnold was not a stranger when he stepped forward. They show why his rise, though rapid, was not baseless. The later Arnold would become a master symbol of violated trust. Yet in the beginning, trust was exactly the resource that allowed him to matter. People do not hand responsibility to a name alone. They hand it to someone whose prior conduct, position, or usefulness makes the decision appear reasonable. At the outbreak of the Revolution, Arnold's business success and militia captaincy gave him that appearance. The record does not ask us to admire it. It asks us to notice it. That is the pre-war portrait, not yet the man of invisible ink, not yet the commander at West Point, not yet the wounded officer whose boot would be memorialized without his name. He is Benedict Arnold of Connecticut, born in Norwich, established in New Haven, standing at the edge of a conflict that would turn local men into national figures with extraordinary speed. And once the war opened, Arnold moved from standing to action. The road from New Haven soon ran toward a British-held post in New York, a place with cannon, strategic value, and the promise of sudden glory. Fort Ticonderoga would be the first great stage on which Benedict Arnold's revolutionary reputation began to form. From New Haven, the road to reputation did not lead first to a long campaign or a formal battlefield. It led to a fort. Fort Ticonderoga stood in New York, held by the British, and in the spring of 1775, it became one of the first important prizes of the new war. For Benedict Arnold, it was the place where his public identity changed quickly. He was no longer only the successful businessman and militia captain from New Haven. He became part of a dramatic military success at the very beginning of the Revolution, a success tied to a name that would remain in the record beside his own, Ethan Allen. The confirmed fact is direct. Benedict Arnold participated with Ethan Allen in the capture of British-held Fort Ticonderoga on May 10, 1775. The post contained a major store of cannon. That is the core of the event, and it is enough to explain why it mattered. In a war that had barely begun, cannon were not background objects. They were power in physical form. They were heavy, difficult to move, difficult to replace, and essential to any army that hoped to do more than gather men with small arms. A cannon was not only a weapon, it was metal, logistics, transport, skill, and authority. It allowed a force to threaten fortified positions, command approaches, and change the balance between militia enthusiasm and organized war. So the capture of Fort Ticonderoga was not simply a symbolic victory, though it certainly had symbolic force. It was a seizure of military material. The Americans gained access to a major store of cannon at a moment when the rebellion needed more than declarations and local resolve. It needed the equipment of war. That is why this episode belongs early in Arnold's story. If we begin with West Point, Arnold appears first as the betrayer. If we begin with Saratoga, he appears as the wounded hero whose later treason is almost impossible to absorb. But Fort Ticonderoga shows something more immediate, Arnold entering the revolution, not from the margins, but through an action that had real military consequence. The archive does not require us to make him the sole figure in the capture. Ethan Allen was involved, and the event belongs to more than one man. But Arnold's presence there matters because it gave him proximity to success at the moment when reputations were being made very quickly. The revolution was still taking shape. Authority was uneven. Command structures were not yet settled into the forms that would later define the Continental Army. In that fluid opening, a man who moved decisively could seem to rise almost overnight. Arnold was that kind of figure in the record. He had been positioned by local standing in New Haven. At Ticonderoga, he became associated with action. The shift is important. A businessman and militia captain might be useful in a town. A man connected to the capture of a British-held fort and a store of cannon could become useful to a cause. There is a quiet danger in telling the Arnold story backward. Because his name later becomes an epithet, every early action can be made to look like disguise. Every success can be treated as a prelude to corruption. But that is not how events unfolded for those living through them. In May of 1775, Arnold's future treason was not visible. What was visible was a British post taken, cannon made available, and an ambitious officer connected to the operation. The crime and power structure of this life depends on that point. Arnold's later betrayal was not the act of an obscure outsider. It came from someone who had first been welcomed into the inner story of the war. Fort Ticonderoga is one of the first reasons that happened. Imagine the record as a table of materials: names, places, dates, weapons. Benedict Arnold, Ethan Allen, Fort Ticonderoga, New York, May 10, 1775. British-held post. Major store of cannon. These are simple entries, but together they mark the beginning of a military career that would grow more complicated with every campaign. The cannon are especially important because they give the event weight beyond personality. If the chapter were only about rivalry or glory, it would be too thin. The lasting fact is practical. The American side gained access to valuable military material early in the war. In a conflict where supply, transport, and firepower could shape possibility, that mattered. Armies could not live on patriotic language alone. They required powder, guns, boats, food, roads, rivers, commanders, and the ability to move all of it through difficult ground. That practical dimension will follow Arnold. Again and again, his early war record is tied to movement and material. At Ticonderoga, the prize was cannon. Later, on the way to Quebec, the problem would be boats, rivers, portages, food, and endurance. On Lake Champlain, it would be a flotilla built to resist a British advance. At West Point, much later, the object of betrayal would not be only a fort in the abstract, but a whole defensive system of river, chain, batteries, redoubts, and strategic geography. Fort Ticonderoga introduces that pattern in its simplest form. A place held by the British. A sudden American success, a store of weapons that could be turned toward the larger war. Arnold's role there gave him entry into the Revolution's record of useful men. And yet, even at this early stage, the story resists clean hero-making. Arnold shared the stage. Ethan Allen's name stands with his. The success belonged to a broader American effort, not to one officer's legend. But Arnold was there, and being there mattered. In the making of wartime reputations, presence at the right event could become a credential. Ticonderoga was such an event. For listeners who know Arnold only as the man who tried to surrender West Point, there is a necessary adjustment here. The same name that would later appear in the papers of treason first appears in scenes of service. The same man who would communicate secretly with British officers had first helped secure cannon from a British-held post. That does not excuse what came later. It deepens the record. It makes the later betrayal more severe because trust had been built on real acts. This is why American memory has had trouble with Arnold. It is easier to remember a traitor who was always false. It is harder to remember a traitor who once contributed materially to the cause he betrayed. Fort Ticonderoga forces that difficulty into view. The capture was not imaginary. The cannon were not symbolic only. The success was part of the early American war effort, and Arnold was connected to it. At this stage, his ambition and his usefulness moved in the same direction. The revolution needed officers willing to act. Arnold needed a stage on which action could be noticed. Fort Ticonderoga supplied both. It was a British-held place, taken in the opening weeks of war, and it held weapons the American side badly valued. In the archive-report version of the story, that is the first taste of glory, not applause alone, but possession of something that could alter military capacity. The event also helps explain why Arnold's later assignments did not come from nowhere. He was not simply promoted out of imagination. His early record included a dramatic success tied to a real strategic prize. When the revolution expanded beyond local alarms into extended campaigns, men with that kind of record could be called upon again. Arnold had shown that he could move toward danger, attach himself to decisive action, and emerge with credit. From Fort Ticonderoga, the map of Arnold's war begins to widen. The captured cannon mark one kind of military problem: how to obtain the material needed to fight. Soon another problem would appear: how to move men through vast and punishing terrain toward an objective far beyond the ordinary reach of local militia action. That next movement would not be defined by the sudden seizure of a fort. It would be slower, wetter, colder, and more desperate. Arnold's path would turn from the prize at Ticonderoga toward Newburyport, the Kennebec River, Reuben Colburn's Bateaux at Pittston, and the long passage through the Maine wilderness toward Quebec. The first taste of glory had come with cannon. The next test would come by river: portage, hunger, and force of will. From the cannon at Ticonderoga, Arnold's war moved into a different kind of test. The seizure of a British-held fort had been dramatic, concentrated, and immediately useful. The expedition toward Quebec in 1775 was something else: a long gamble across water, forest, and uncertain supply lines. It asked whether an army could be pushed through country that resisted movement at every stage. The route itself tells us how ambitious the plan was. Arnold's expedition did not simply march along established roads toward a nearby post. It moved toward Quebec by way of the Kennebec River and the Maine wilderness. The American Battlefield Trust describes the expedition as carrying roughly 1,100 Continental soldiers across more than 300 miles of wilderness. In a war still young, before institutions had fully hardened, and before the Continental Army had learned all the limits of distance, that figure matters. It was not a scouting party. It was not a symbolic raid. It was an armed column, meant to move as a military force through a region where the landscape became one of the expedition's principal enemies. The departure point was Newburyport, Massachusetts. From there, the expedition entered the larger geography of river passage and inland endurance. Newburyport placed Arnold's men at the edge of movement by water, but the water did not solve the problem. It only changed its form. Rivers could carry boats and supplies, but only where current, depth, weather, and human strength allowed. A river route through Maine was not the same as a road. It required men to row, paddle, haul, lift, repair, reload, and keep going when the river stopped being helpful. The Kennebec River became the line of advance. In the archive of this campaign, the Kennebec is not just a place name. It is the spine of the expedition's plan. The army would follow it into the interior, using boats where possible and portage where necessary. Every mile depended on coordination between bodies, boats, provisions, weapons, and time. The soldiers were not only fighting men. They became laborers in a moving system, required to keep their arms dry enough, their food secure enough, and their boats intact enough to continue. That is why Reuben Colburn's boat-building site at Pittston, Maine becomes important. Arnold had arranged for Colburn to build the bateau that the expedition would use. These boats were essential equipment, not background detail. Without them, the route by the Kennebec would have been only a line on a map. At Pittston, the practical plan became visible in timber, seams, oars, paddles, and setting poles. The expedition inspected the bateau there, and the moment carries a quiet significance. A commander's ambition had to pass through the hands of a builder. Strategy had to become boats. The bateau was a tool suited to inland water movement, but it was also a burden. A boat that could carry men and supplies on the river became dead weight when the river route broke or when obstacles forced to carry. In this kind of campaign, Equipment could change character instantly. What helped on one stretch could punish the men on another. The same hull that allowed movement through water could become something to drag, lift, or repair. The same provisions that kept the column alive could slow it down. The expedition's success depended on managing those contradictions again and again. This is where Arnold's reputation, still being made, takes on a harder texture. At Ticonderoga, his name had been attached to a valuable military success. On the Quebec expedition, the claim was endurance. The documentary record summarized in the American Battlefield Trust's account places him at the head of roughly 1,100 Continental soldiers moving through more than 300 miles of wilderness. Those words can pass quickly, but they contain the shape of the ordeal. More than 300 miles meant days and weeks of repeated effort. Roughly 1,100 soldiers meant mouths to feed, bodies to keep moving, discipline to maintain, and a column long enough that every delay could spread through the whole expedition. The Maine wilderness did not have to defeat the army in a single blow. It could do so by accumulation. Wet clothing, damaged boats, spoiled supplies, exhaustion, confusion over distance, and the constant work of movement could wear down the expedition before it ever reached an enemy wall. In a conventional battlefield narrative, danger often appears as gunfire. Here, danger also appeared as current, mud, cold, distance, and scarcity. The campaign demanded force of will, but will alone could not row a bateau, carry a load, or replace lost food. Arnold's challenge was to turn will into repeated physical action. There is a reason this chapter of Arnold's life remained part of the story, even after his name became inseparable from treason. The Quebec March shows why he could first be seen as extraordinary. Before the coded correspondence, before West Point, before the attempt to hand a strategic post to the British, Arnold was trusted with tasks that required audacity. He was not yet remembered as the man who would betray. He was becoming known as the officer who would attempt what others might judge nearly impossible. Still, the archive report view requires caution. The march should not be turned into a simple legend of heroic determination. It was also a logistical operation, full of friction. Newburyport, the Kennebec route, Pittston, and Colburn's Bateaux anchor the story in material realities. The expedition was not carried forward by personality alone. It depended on boats built in advance, river knowledge, labor, supply planning, and the ability to keep men together under pressure. Arnold's command mattered because someone had to direct this movement. But the movement itself belonged to the entire column, to every soldier who rode, hauled, carried, and endured. The scale also reveals something about the early Revolutionary War. The American cause was still assembling itself, still testing how far it could project military power. To send roughly 1,100 Continental soldiers toward Quebec through the Maine wilderness was to imagine a war beyond local defense. It was an attempt to reach northward, to pressure British power in Canada, and to do so by a route that promised surprise but demanded suffering. The plan contained both boldness and risk. Those qualities would follow Arnold through much of his military career. For Arnold personally, the expedition deepened the contradiction that later makes his biography so difficult to hold in one frame. The same man who would become the most famous traitor in American memory once led men through one of the most punishing marches of the war. The later crime does not erase the earlier endurance. The earlier endurance does not excuse the later crime. Both remain in the record, and the tension between them is the reason Arnold's story has such force. He was not an insignificant officer whose betrayal became famous only because it was shocking. He was a proven officer, tested in places where ambition had to survive contact with terrain. As the expedition pushed farther inland, the demands became more severe. The Kennebec route required more than following water north. There were stopping points, carries, and stretches where the boats themselves had to be moved by human effort. The army's progress depended on the condition of the bateaux and on the men's ability to keep supplies with them. Every practical detail mattered: how a boat handled, how much it could carry, how it was propelled, how it was moved when the river no longer carried it. The expedition was becoming less a march than a struggle between design and wilderness. That struggle would soon narrow into the mechanics of survival. The bateaux arranged through Reuben Colburn were meant to make the route possible, but they would also expose the expedition to the risks of river travel and portage. Fort Western, Fort Halifax, the Great Carrying Place, and the ponds beyond it would mark the path more precisely. Then the dead river would test the whole undertaking with water in its most destructive form, damaging boats and sweeping away what the soldiers needed most. For now, Arnold's column is still moving into the interior, held together by orders, labor, and momentum, with Quebec still ahead and the wilderness already beginning to exact its price. The expedition's problem was no longer simply distance. It was contact, wood against rock, hull against current, wet stores against colder weather, human strength against a route that allowed no easy correction once the army had committed itself. Arnold's column had entered the interior with Quebec still ahead, but the road to Quebec was not a road in the ordinary sense. It was a chain of waterways, carrying places, ponds, and river passages, each one demanding a different kind of labor. At the center of that design were the Bateaux. Arnold had arranged for Reuben Colburn to build 200 of them. The requirement was practical and specific. Each bateau was intended to row with 4 oars. Each was also to be supplied with paddles and setting poles. That detail matters because it shows what the expedition expected from the Kennebec route. These were not boats meant for one simple motion downstream. They had to be rowed where there was enough room and water. They had to be paddled in tighter places. They had to be forced forward by poles where the current, shallows, rocks, or riverbed demanded it. A bateau was not merely transportation. It was a moving warehouse, a food container, a troop carrier, and, when the river failed, a burden that men had to drag, lift, repair, and carry. The more closely the route is followed, the clearer it becomes that the Quebec expedition was a military operation built around repeated changes in motion. Sailors' work, infantry work, and laborers' work collapsed into one continuous task. The column's passage through Fort Western and present-day Augusta placed it at one of the known points on the Kennebec line. Fort Western was an old wooden stockade, and in this story, it stands less as a battlefield than as a marker of transition. Here, the expedition was moving deeper into the interior system that would decide whether Arnold's plan could remain an army's route or become a wilderness ordeal. From there, the path led on toward Fort Halifax at Winslow, near the Kennebec and Sebasticook rivers. Fort Halifax mattered as a resupply point, a place where the expedition could still be understood in organized terms: men, provisions, boats, orders, and movement through a mapped corridor. But the geography ahead was already narrowing the choices. The Kennebec route did not simply carry Arnold's men forward like a road. It broke the march into stages, and every stage consumed strength. The Great Carrying Place was one of the clearest examples. It was a nearly 12-mile portage past East Carry Pond, Middle Carry Pond, and West Carry Pond. The name sounds almost administrative, as if it belonged to a ledger or a surveyor's line. But for the soldiers, it meant removing the expedition from water and making the land itself into an obstacle. Boats that had been built to float had to be moved by muscle. Supplies that had been packed for river travel had to be carried across ground. The route became a test not only of endurance, but of sequence: unload, carry, return, carry again, launch, reload, and continue. A portage of nearly 12 miles does not behave like a single action. It multiplies itself. A man does not carry an army's load once. He carries what he can, then goes back for more. Boats require teams. Provisions require protection. Ammunition, clothing, tools, and camp gear must not be abandoned unless the whole expedition is prepared to pay for it later. What had looked on paper like a passage between waterways became an extended tax on the column's strength and time. The ponds along the Great Carrying Place gave the route a rhythm: east, middle, and west. But rhythm should not be mistaken for ease. Each pond required another adjustment. The men moved from carrying to floating, from floating back to carrying, from the labor of the shore to the uncertainty of the water. The expedition survived by conversion, turning soldiers into boatmen, boatmen into porters, and porters back into soldiers. Arnold's command held together only if that conversion could be repeated, again and again. This is one reason the Quebec March became such an important part of Arnold's early reputation. It did not offer the simple drama of Fort Ticonderoga, where a British-held post and its cannon could be named as the prize. The Maine wilderness offered no single object that could stand for victory. Instead, it offered accumulation: wet clothing, damaged boats, sore bodies, shrinking provisions, and the knowledge that every mile behind the column made retreat harder, while every mile ahead might be worse. Then came the Dead River. The name alone has a bleak sound, but the disaster there was not symbolic. It was material. Flooding damaged boats and washed away food, gear, and supplies. The same water system that the expedition depended upon became destructive. The Bateaux had been planned as the means of crossing the wilderness. On the Dead River, floodwater exposed how fragile that plan could be when the route itself changed faster than men could answer. A damaged boat was not an isolated inconvenience. It threatened everything loaded inside it and everything scheduled to move with it. Food lost to floodwater could not be replaced by determination. Gear swept away could not simply be imagined back into service. Supplies in an expedition like this were not comforts. They were the difference between an army still operating under command and a body of men sliding toward hunger and exhaustion. The Dead River disaster therefore marks a turning point in the mechanics of the expedition. Before it, the march was punishing, but still organized around a plan: boats, rivers, portages, forts, ponds, and steady movement toward Canada. After it, the expedition was forced toward desperation. The column still had a destination, but its margin of safety had been stripped away. The wilderness had taken not only time and labor, but the stored resources that made continued movement possible. In archive terms, this is where the Quebec expedition becomes most useful for understanding Arnold before the treason. It shows the kind of command experience that helped make him famous. He was not simply present in a difficult campaign. He led men through a route where physical systems kept failing, boats damaged, provisions lost, passages blocked by land or water. The record does not require embellishment. The known facts are severe enough. An expedition of roughly 1,100 Continental soldiers, moving across more than 300 miles of wilderness, had reached a point where boats and food could be swept away by flood, and yet the objective still pulled them onward. The move toward the Chaudière River settlements came out of that pressure. Advance parties sought provisions near those settlements because the expedition could not survive on reputation, courage, or orders alone. It needed food. That search for provisions shows how the campaign had changed. The plan had been to move an army toward Quebec. Now parts of that army had to press ahead toward inhabited places, not merely for strategic advantage, but because the line of supply had been broken by the route itself. There is a quiet cruelty in this kind of campaign. A battle announces itself. A fort can be pointed to. A wound can be seen. But hunger, wetness, and loss of equipment work more slowly. They degrade an expedition before the enemy is even fully encountered. The Dead River did not defeat Arnold's force in the formal sense. It did something more insidious. It thinned the expedition's capacity to arrive as the force it had been intended to be. And yet, the march continued. That persistence would become part of Arnold's legend in the American War, one of the reasons his later betrayal struck with such force. The man who would one day try to deliver West Point into British hands had first helped drive soldiers through one of the harshest American operations of the early Revolution. He had dealt not only with ambition and command, but with the practical misery of Bateaux, portages, flooded rivers, and vanishing provisions. By the time the expedition pushed toward the settlements near the Chaudière River, Quebec was no longer just a target on a campaign plan. It had become the endpoint of an ordeal that had already consumed supplies, damaged equipment, and tested the men before the city itself came into view. The wilderness had done its work before the walls of Quebec would do theirs. Arnold's column was still moving, but it was moving toward a colder and more violent reckoning, where the cost of the march would meet the danger of an assault, and where Arnold's body would again become part of the record. By the time Arnold's column neared the settlements along the Chaudière River, the expedition had already been damaged by the country it had crossed. The route from the Kennebec through the Maine wilderness had not simply delayed the force. It had reduced it, soaked it, and tested the practical limits of an army moving by bateau, portage, and hunger. Quebec City still stood ahead as the military objective, but by late December, the campaign had already become something more revealing than a line on a map. It had become an early record of how far Benedict Arnold was willing to push himself, and others, in pursuit of a dangerous result. The assault on Quebec City came on December 31st, 1775. The confirmed outcome is stark. The American attack failed. Richard Montgomery was killed. Benedict Arnold was severely wounded. For a crime and power story, those facts matter because they belong to the same life that later produced the West Point conspiracy. The man who would become America's most famous traitor was not, at this stage, an officer watching the war from a safe distance. He was not building a reputation through paperwork alone. He had already been associated with the capture of British-held Fort Ticonderoga, a success that opened access to a major store of cannon. He had then led a force toward Quebec by way of the Kennebec River and the Maine wilderness, a route the American Battlefield Trust describes as carrying roughly 1,100 Continental soldiers across more than 300 miles of wilderness. Now, at Quebec City, the expedition reached its violent test, and Arnold's own body entered the archive as evidence of exposure to combat. The temptation in a story so dominated by the later word traitor is to treat every earlier episode as foreshadowing. That can distort the record. In 1775, Arnold's future betrayal had not happened. The West Point plot, the secret communications, the coded writing, Major John André, and the attempted surrender of an American stronghold all belonged to years still ahead. At Quebec, the record is not yet the record of treason. It is the record of a failed American military operation, a dead general in Richard Montgomery, and a wounded commander in Benedict Arnold. But the later betrayal changes the way the evidence feels. It makes the wound harder to dismiss as a stray battlefield detail. Arnold was not merely present in the revolution before he turned against it. He repeatedly accepted roles in which danger was immediate and personal. At Quebec City, the cost was severe injury. At Bemis Heights, on October 7, 1777, he would again be severely wounded, this time in the left leg near the Bremen fortified camp while helping direct American attacks against John Burgoyne's forces. Saratoga would become one of the great American victories of the war, and the National Park Service identifies Burgoyne's surrender on October 17th as important in convincing France to support American independence. That later wound would become so central to public memory that the National Park Service's Boot Monument at Saratoga commemorates Arnold's battlefield service and injury without naming him. Quebec, then, is not an isolated injury. It is part of a documented pattern. Arnold's military identity in the early war was built through operations that demanded unusual endurance. First came the drama of Fort Ticonderoga on May 10, 1775, when American forces with Arnold and Ethan Allen involved captured a British-held post and gained access to valuable cannon. Then came the march toward Quebec, Newburyport as a departure point, the Kennebec River as a route, Reuben Colburn's boat-building site at Pittston, Fort Western, Fort Halifax, the Great Carrying Place, the Dead River, and the desperate movement toward the Chaudière River settlements. Finally came the assault on Quebec City itself, where ambition met a defended target and failed. The failure is important. Arnold's early record was not an uninterrupted chain of victories. The Quebec expedition had shown stamina and daring, but it did not deliver the city. The assault on December 31st ended with American loss, the death of Richard Montgomery, and Arnold's severe wound. This is one reason the archive-report approach is necessary. The story does not need to turn Arnold into a mythic hero in order to make his later treason shocking. It only needs to hold the confirmed record in place. He took part in meaningful American operations. He endured physical danger. He was wounded in service to the cause he would later betray. That contradiction is the engine of the whole biography. If Arnold had been obscure, his treason would have been a different kind of crime. If he had been a failed outsider, denied any role in the war's serious campaigns, the West Point plot might look like bitterness from the margins. But Arnold was not marginal. He had been visible from the beginning. He had stood near the center of early American action, at Ticonderoga, on the Wilderness Road to Quebec, before Quebec City, and later on Lake Champlain and at Saratoga. His name had already gathered military meaning before it became an American epithet. Richard Montgomery's death also gives the Quebec assault its own gravity. Montgomery was not a minor casualty in the record supplied by this campaign. His death marks the failed assault as a serious military disaster, not simply a setback in Arnold's personal story. The American effort against Quebec City had brought separate lines of revolutionary ambition to one point, and the result was costly. A commander was killed. Another was severely wounded. The city was not taken. The hoped-for gain in Canada did not materialize in the way the attackers intended. For Arnold, the wound narrowed the distance between reputation and sacrifice. In later years, accusations around debt, rank, reputation, misconduct charges, and secret dealings with the British would crowd his name. But in the winter of 1775, the record places him at the front edge of an assault that failed. That matters because treason, when it comes, will not erase the earlier service. It will corrupt its memory. It will force Americans to decide how to remember a man who risked himself for their cause before trying to sell out one of its most strategic posts. This is why Arnold's wound at Quebec should not be handled as legend. It should be handled as documentation. The assault occurred on December 31st, 1775. It failed. Richard Montgomery was killed. Arnold was severely wounded. Those are the fixed points. Around them sits the larger pattern, a commander whose early career repeatedly involved hard movement, improvised operations, physical risk, and proximity to violence. The betrayal to come becomes more shocking, not because the earlier wounds make him noble forever, but because they prove that the later traitor had once paid real bodily costs in the American War. After Quebec, Arnold's war did not end. The failed assault did not remove him from the larger military story. In 1776, he would turn from the wilderness route and the city target to another kind of theater altogether, Lake Champlain. There, near Valcour Island, on October 11th, he would help create and fight with a flotilla against a British fleet, in an action remembered not as a simple victory, but for the delay it imposed on British operations from Canada. The same officer who had pushed men through rivers and portages would soon be improvising resistance on water again, this time on a lake corridor whose strategic value reached far beyond the vessels themselves. After Quebec, Arnold's record carried both failure and endurance. The assault had not taken the city. Richard Montgomery was dead, and Arnold had been severely wounded. Yet the war did not pause around his injury, and it did not leave him fixed in one kind of service. The same conflict that had demanded a march through the Maine wilderness now demanded something different, a defense of a lake corridor. In 1776, the setting shifted to Lake Champlain. The geography mattered. Lake Champlain was not simply a body of water between wooded shores. It was a route. It connected the northern approaches from Canada with the interior line toward the Hudson Valley and the American positions farther south. An army moving from Canada did not have to think only in terms of roads. It had to think in terms of waterways, landing places, transport, and control of movement. Whoever controlled the lake could shape the timing and direction of operations. Arnold's role there was unusual, even by the standards of his already unusual war. He had been tied to Fort Ticonderoga, where American forces gained access to a major store of cannon. He had led men up the Kennebec River through portages and flooded wilderness toward Quebec City. Now, in 1776, he was associated with the construction of a flotilla on Lake Champlain, an improvised naval force intended to resist British movement from the north. This was not the image most often attached to Revolutionary War command. It was not a clean line of infantry forming on open ground, and it was not a conventional fortress assault. It was a hurried answer to a strategic problem. The British could operate from Canada. The American side needed time. Arnold's contribution at Lake Champlain was to help turn that need for time into a physical obstacle, vessels on the water, positioned to contest a British fleet. The action near Valcour Island took place on October 11, 1776. Arnold fought there against a British fleet, and the confirmed result was not a straightforward American victory in the ordinary sense. The significance lay in delay. The fighting at Valcour Island delayed British operations from Canada. That point is easy to understate because delay can sound passive. It can sound like the absence of decision, or like a lesser kind of achievement when compared with the capture of a fort or the surrender of an army. But in war, time is not empty. Time allows defenses to be strengthened. Time forces an enemy to confront weather, supply, distance, and season. Time can alter the shape of a campaign, even when the immediate tactical result looks unfavorable. Valcour Island belongs to that category of action. It mattered because it interrupted momentum. The British had resources, organization, and a northern base from which to operate. The American position required resistance strong enough to keep those operations from unfolding on the British timetable. Arnold's flotilla was part of that resistance. The lake itself became the battlefield, and the lake was also the road. That was the central fact. On land, an army could be slowed by broken roads, bad bridges, mud, rivers, and the limits of animals and wagons. On Lake Champlain, movement depended on vessels and command of the water. If a fleet could move freely, it could carry force along the corridor. If it met resistance, even resistance that could not destroy it, the calendar changed. Arnold's earlier campaign helps explain why this was not a strange assignment for him, even if it was an unusual one. The Quebec expedition had already forced him to think in terms of waterways, boats, material preparation, and movement through difficult terrain. The bateau built by Reuben Colburn at Pittston had been designed to carry men and supplies through a punishing route toward Canada. That effort had nearly collapsed under the strain of river travel, portage, and flood. But it had also shown Arnold operating in a world where military ambition depended on practical transportation. At Lake Champlain, the problem was again transportation, but now in reverse. Instead of trying to push an American force north toward Quebec, the task was to obstruct British movement south from Canada. The scale and form had changed. The underlying question had not. Could men, materials, and command be organized fast enough to effect a campaign along a water route? The answer, at Valcour Island, was yes, though not in the clean language of triumph. Arnold constructed a flotilla. He fought the British fleet. The action delayed British operations from Canada. These are compact facts, but together they show a form of military service that was neither decorative nor marginal. It was emergency construction, command under pressure, and strategic obstruction. For Arnold's later story, that matters. The treason at West Point would eventually involve a different kind of military geography: the Hudson River, its difficult bend, its defenses, its forts, its great chain, its value as a strategic line through the American war effort. Long before that plot, Arnold had already understood that waterways could decide campaigns. Lake Champlain gave him another lesson in how a river or lake corridor could be more than scenery. It could be a hinge. The irony is not that Arnold knew too little about American defenses. It is that he knew too much. He had served in places where movement and obstruction determined military possibility. He had seen how a fort, a store of cannon, a wilderness route, a city wall, and a lake passage could carry consequences beyond the immediate scene. Valcour Island adds to that pattern. It places Arnold not only among officers who fought, but among those who grasped the value of delaying an enemy at the right point on the map. There is also a human contrast in the record. At Quebec, Arnold's body had been part of the evidence. He was severely wounded in a failed assault. At Lake Champlain, the emphasis is less on his injury and more on his capacity to improvise. He appears as a commander, adapting to a new domain. The man who had marched through the Maine wilderness now fought on a lake. The war kept assigning him forms of difficulty that required energy, speed, and a willingness to operate at the edge of available resources. That adaptability helped make his reputation. It also complicates the later moral simplicity of his name. If Benedict Arnold had been only an obscure officer who betrayed a trust, his name might not have carried the same historical force. The shock depends on the earlier record. Fort Ticonderoga, Quebec, Valcour Island, and later Saratoga all stand behind the eventual collapse of loyalty. Valcour Island is essential because it shows service without the glamour of an obvious victory. It shows a contribution measured by what did not happen as soon as the British intended. A delayed operation leaves a quieter trace than a captured city. It does not produce the same kind of ceremonial memory, but military consequences often move in that quieter space. The British did not simply sweep forward from Canada on their preferred schedule. American resistance on Lake Champlain forced a pause. The flotilla near Valcour Island bought time. Time would matter again. The Northern War did not end on Lake Champlain. The pressures from Canada would remain part of the wider revolutionary struggle, and British movement from the north would later bring the name John Burgoyne into the center of the story. The ground would shift from Lakewater to the approaches around Saratoga to places such as Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, where American positions, commanders, and rival reputations would collide. Arnold came out of Valcour Island with another entry in the record of service, not a final victory, but a strategic delay. In the archive of his life, that kind of achievement sits uneasily beside what came later. He had helped slow British operations from Canada in 1776. A year after Valcour Island, on another northern front, his aggression would again become part of a decisive American moment. But at Saratoga, the record would also begin to gather the ingredients of future bitterness: command, credit, wounds, and memory. The shift from Valcour Island to Saratoga was not just a change of terrain. It was a change in the scale of consequence. On Lake Champlain, Arnold had helped delay British operations from Canada. Around Saratoga, that northern pressure returned in another form, attached now to the name of John Burgoyne and to a campaign that would test not only armies, but reputations. The ground itself mattered. Saratoga was not a single point on a map, and the campaign cannot be understood as one open field where two lines simply met. The names that survive in the record form a small geography of pressure: Freeman's Farm, Bemis Heights, the American positions along the approaches, and the fortified places that would soon become markers in Arnold's own story. These were not ornamental details. They shaped movement, command, and memory. Bemis Heights was especially important because it was part of the American defensive position. The Americans were not merely waiting for Burgoyne's army in empty country. They occupied ground with military purpose. Their positions were associated with a campaign in which terrain, fortification, and command decisions were closely linked. The National Park Service interpretation of the battlefield preserves this sense of place. Saratoga was a landscape where farms, heights, roads, and redoubts became part of the outcome. Among the figures tied to that landscape was Tadeusz Kościuszko. His name belongs in this chapter not as decoration, but because the American positions at Saratoga were not accidental. Kościuszko, a Polish engineer serving the American cause, was part of the broader command world that turned terrain into defense. In a war often remembered through bold charges and famous wounds, engineering can seem quiet. But at Saratoga, quiet work mattered. Heights had to be read. Approaches had to be judged. A position had to be made useful before it could be defended. Arnold entered this setting with a record already marked by risk. He had been associated with the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, had led men through the Kennebec route and the Maine wilderness toward Quebec, had been severely wounded in the failed assault on Quebec City, and had built and fought with a flotilla near Valcour Island. By the time the Saratoga campaign unfolded in 1777, Arnold was not an unknown officer trying to create a name from nothing. He was already a controversial and forceful presence in the Continental Army's Northern War. But Saratoga placed him inside a command structure that was not his alone. Horatio Gates commanded the American army in the campaign. Gates's name would become inseparable from Saratoga because command carried official visibility. Orders, reports, and public memory often gathered around the officer at the top. That did not mean every action on the field came from him personally. It did mean that credit, once victory arrived, would have a formal route through the chain of command. That is one of the reasons Saratoga became so important to Arnold's later bitterness. The battlefield record and the command record were not always experienced the same way by the men who made them. Arnold had a pattern of aggressive service. He had a record of exposed personal danger. Yet the formal world of rank and command did not always reward action in the way an officer believed it should. At Saratoga, that tension would become sharper. On the British side stood John Burgoyne. His movement from Canada brought the northern threat back into focus after the delay of the previous year. Burgoyne's campaign placed pressure on the American position and gave the fighting around Saratoga its larger strategic meaning. This was not a local quarrel between commanders over a patch of farmland. It was part of the British effort to shape the war through movement from the north, the same broad theater in which Lake Champlain had mattered. The American side included more than Gates and Arnold. Daniel Morgan was also part of the Saratoga story. His presence reminds us that the American army in this campaign was not a single personality wearing a uniform. It was a collection of officers, units, skills, and temperaments. Some men were valued for discipline, some for battlefield initiative, some for engineering, some for the ability to command troops in difficult ground. Saratoga drew these elements together under pressure. The British side, too, had its recognizable figures. Simon Fraser appears in the Saratoga record as one of the important British officers associated with Burgoyne's force. The names matter because they show the campaign as a collision of command worlds. Gates and Burgoyne were the senior figures whose names framed the armies. Arnold, Morgan, Fraser, and Kosciuszko were part of the practical military reality on and around the field. Each name helps restore the campaign from a simple label into a human and organizational event. Freeman's Farm was one of the key battlefield areas. The name sounds almost domestic, as many Revolutionary War battlefield names do: a farm, a height, a road, a river bend. But in war, ordinary places acquire a second identity. Freeman's Farm became part of the Saratoga fighting, part of the sequence that would lead to the more decisive American action at Bemis Heights. The ground that had once been described by ownership and use became described by casualties, maneuvers, and command disputes. The John Nielsen farmstead also belongs to this setting. According to National Park Service interpretation, it was used by American generals, including Arnold, as a makeshift headquarters during Bemis Heights. That detail is small, but it is valuable. It brings the listener away from the abstract word campaign and into a structure where officers gathered, argued, planned, and waited for reports. A farmstead used as headquarters is a reminder that Revolutionary War Command often operated from adapted civilian spaces. The infrastructure of war was improvised out of what the landscape offered. George Washington, though not the field commander at Saratoga, belongs to the broader command world around Arnold's career. Washington's role in Arnold's life would become much more direct in the years ahead, especially when Arnold later received responsibility for West Point and its dependencies. But even before that future betrayal, Washington represented the larger Continental command system in which Arnold sought recognition, rank, and trust. Saratoga would intensify the question of what Arnold believed he had earned from that system. This is the difficulty in telling Arnold's story honestly. If the account begins with treason, Saratoga becomes only a prelude to guilt. If the account stops at Saratoga, Arnold becomes only a wounded hero. The archive forces both facts to remain in view. At Saratoga, before the wound that would mark him physically, Arnold stood inside one of the most important American military moments of the war. The later plot against West Point does not erase that, but neither does the service at Saratoga erase the later plot. The campaign also shows how military reputation could be created by layers. There was the visible layer of battle, where a man rode, where he directed troops, where he exposed himself to fire. There was the official layer of command, who held authority, who reported victory, who received public credit. There was the memory layer afterward. Who was named, who was omitted, who became a symbol, and who became an embarrassment. Arnold's Saratoga reputation would eventually pass through all three. That is why Bemis Heights carries such weight in his biography. Before the famous wound, the place was already prepared by terrain, engineering, command tension, and the presence of armies moving toward decision. Freeman's Farm had helped define the battlefield environment. Bemis Heights anchored the American position. Kosciuszko's defensive work, Gates's command, Burgoyne's advance, Morgan's role, Fraser's presence, and Arnold's aggression all converged in a campaign where the stakes were larger than personal honor. Yet personal honor is impossible to remove from the story, because Arnold himself did not live only in the clean language of strategy. He lived within rank, credit, injury, and reputation. Saratoga would become central to how others remembered him and to how he understood himself. It would also become central to the later public discomfort over his memory. How to honor a wound received in American service when the wounded man later tried to deliver West Point to the British. For now, the record holds at the edge of the action. The American positions are in place. Burgoyne's army is the enemy before them. Gates commands. Arnold is present, restless within the command world around him. Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights are no longer just locations in the countryside. They are becoming the setting for the event that would secure Arnold's battlefield fame, deepen the quarrel over credit, and leave his left leg as one of the most complicated relics of the American Revolution. The previous moment left Arnold at the edge of the Saratoga action, inside a command world that was already tense with questions of authority and credit. On October 7, 1777, that tension moved into the open field. The setting was Bemis Heights, part of the same Saratoga ground where the American army stood against John Burgoyne's advancing force. The names around Arnold still mattered. Horatio Gates in command of the American army, Burgoyne leading the British, Daniel Morgan among the aggressive American fighters, and the defensive landscape shaped in part by Tadeusz Kościuszko's engineering eye. But on this day, the archive narrows toward motion, combat, and injury. The Battle of Bemis Heights became the decisive American tactical victory of the Saratoga campaign. That sentence can sound clean, as if the outcome were obvious from the start. It was not. What the records preserve is a day when British forces came under American attack, when pressure built against Burgoyne's army, and when Arnold, despite the command tension surrounding him, helped direct American attacks against the British line. In the later memory of the battle, this is one of the essential facts. Arnold was not merely nearby. He was active in the fighting, pushing the American attack forward. That point matters because Saratoga would become a battlefield of memory as well as a battlefield of armies. Arnold's later treason did not erase his presence at Bemis Heights, though it made that presence uncomfortable. The record does not allow a simple portrait. Here was the same man who would later seek to surrender West Point to the British. Here, on October 7th, he was helping American forces strike at Burgoyne's troops in a fight that would help bring the British campaign to collapse. The contradiction is not decorative. It is the core of the case. The American position around Bemis Heights had been prepared as a place to resist Burgoyne's movement. The earlier fighting around Freeman's Farm had already made clear that this campaign would not be settled by marching alone. By October 7th, Burgoyne's army was under pressure, and the American force had an opportunity to turn that pressure into something more decisive. Arnold's part in the action came through aggression, helping direct attacks, pressing forward, and entering the space where command decisions and physical danger met. The National Park Service interpretation of the Saratoga battlefield identifies the John Nielsen farmstead as a makeshift headquarters used by American generals, including Arnold, during Bemis Heights. That detail gives the day a physical anchor. The battle was not an abstract clash between two flags. It moved through farms, wooded ground, fortified positions, and improvised command spaces. Decisions were made near ordinary buildings pressed into military service. Men moved from those spaces into gunfire. A farmstead became part of the machinery of a campaign. As the American attacks developed, one of the crucial points was the Bremen fortified camp, often described as a redoubt. It was near that position that Arnold was severely wounded in the left leg. The wound would become one of the most famous injuries of the Revolution, not because it was unusual for a field officer to be hurt, but because of what Arnold later became. His left leg, damaged in American service, would stand in painful contrast to his later effort to deliver one of the Revolution's most strategic posts into British hands. At the moment of the wound, however, the later treason had not happened. The record for October 7th is battlefield record. Arnold was at Bemis Heights. He helped direct American attacks against Burgoyne's forces. Near the Bremen fortified camp, he was severely wounded in the left leg. These facts are spare, but they are heavy. They show a man whose courage in the American cause was not invented after the fact. They also show why his later betrayal cut so deeply. He had not been an obscure figure working at the margins. He had paid in blood for the side he would later betray. The casualty figures help measure the scale of the day without turning the battle into spectacle. The National Park Service gives the losses for the Battle of Bemis Heights as over 630 British casualties and about 150 American casualties. Those numbers tell part of the story. The British Army suffered heavily, while the American losses, though real, were significantly lower. In a campaign already straining Burgoyne's force, that imbalance mattered. A tactical defeat on such terms was not merely a bad day in the field. It weakened the Army's ability to continue. Casualty numbers can sometimes flatten human experience into columns of loss. But in an archive report account, they also help keep the narrative disciplined. Over 630 British casualties, about 150 American casualties. The figures do not need embellishment. They point to the severity of the American blow and to the weakening of Burgoyne's position after Bemis Heights. They also help explain why this chapter of Arnold's life sits so prominently in the military record. His wound came not in a minor skirmish, remembered only because of his later fame, but in a decisive engagement within one of the Revolution's most consequential campaigns. The left leg becomes the object that carries the contradiction forward. Arnold had already been severely wounded before, during the failed assault on Quebec City on December 31st, 1775. Saratoga added another injury to the same public record of risk. Again, the point is not to romanticize him. It is to understand why contemporaries and later Americans had such difficulty sorting his memory. A man can be brave in one chapter and criminal in another. A wound can be honorable without making the whole life honorable. The difficulty is that history preserves both truths in the same name. At Bemis Heights, the American victory was tactical and immediate, but its consequences spread beyond the battlefield. Burgoyne's army was now in a deteriorating position. The pressure that had been building through the Saratoga campaign reached its conclusion 10 days later. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga. That surrender became one of the central turning points of the Revolutionary War. The National Park Service identifies the victory at Saratoga as important in convincing France to support American independence. That interpretation gives the battle its wider meaning. Saratoga was not only about the fate of Burgoyne's army. It altered the diplomatic horizon of the war. A military result in upstate New York helped make American independence more credible to a European power whose support would matter deeply. The battlefield and the diplomatic world were linked. What happened at Bemis Heights and Saratoga helped change what other nations believed was possible. This is why Arnold's role cannot be treated as a small footnote, even though later Americans often wished to reduce him to a single word, traitor. At Saratoga, he was part of the American success that helped move France toward support for independence. He was wounded near the Bremen fortified camp in the service of that cause. The later West Point conspiracy would make his name an American warning. But the wound at Bemis Heights remained in the record, resistant to simplification. After October 17th, Saratoga belonged to the American story as a victory. It belonged to the military story as the surrender of Burgoyne's army. It belonged to the diplomatic story as a result important in convincing France to support American independence. And it belonged to Arnold's story as the place where his battlefield fame reached its height and his body carried the proof. That proof would not be easy to commemorate. A nation could celebrate Saratoga. It could honor the victory, the surrender, the turn toward French support. But what should it do with the injured officer who later tried to betray West Point? The answer at Saratoga would become one of the strangest memorial gestures in American public memory, a monument to a wounded leg and not to the man by name. The wound at Bemis Heights left a problem that stone could not easily solve. Saratoga could be remembered as victory. It could be placed in the military record as the campaign that ended with John Burgoyne's surrender on October 17, 1777. It could be placed in the diplomatic record as a turning point the National Park Service identifies as important in convincing France to support American independence. It could be placed on the landscape through battlefield preservation, interpretation, and monuments. But Benedict Arnold's part in that victory resisted the ordinary language of honor. The reason was not that his service there was imaginary. It was not a later family legend, or a patriotic exaggeration without a battlefield beneath it. At Bemis Heights on October 7, 1777, Arnold helped direct American attacks against Burgoyne's forces. Near the Bremen fortified camp, he was severely wounded in the left leg. The Battle of Bemis Heights produced a decisive American tactical victory. The National Park Service gives the losses as over 630 British casualties and about 150 American casualties. 10 days later, Burgoyne surrendered. Those facts do not disappear because Arnold later betrayed the American cause. They sit there, stubbornly, in the archive. They are part of why his treason became so powerful as a national story. If Arnold had been an obscure man, his name might not have become an American synonym for betrayal. The shock came from the contrast. Fort Ticonderoga, the Quebec expedition, Valcour Island, Saratoga, then West Point. The pattern was not a simple rise from insignificance into crime. It was the record of a celebrated officer who had already given the revolution visible service before he tried to sell one of its most strategic posts. At Saratoga, that contradiction is held in one of the most unusual memorial objects in American revolutionary memory, the National Park Service's Boot Monument. It commemorates Arnold's battlefield service and wound without naming him. That absence is the point. A monument usually works by joining a name to an act. It tells the passerby who should be remembered and why. It reduces time into a legible message. This person did this thing here. But Arnold's memory could not be made so clean. To name him plainly at Saratoga would risk honoring a man later remembered chiefly for treason. To omit him completely would falsify the battlefield record. The boot monument stands in the space between those choices. It marks service without granting full public absolution. It acknowledges the wound while withholding the name. In that way, it becomes less like a conventional monument and more like an archive object made of public discomfort. It tells us not only what happened at Saratoga, but what later Americans found difficult to say about what happened there. The object does not erase Arnold. It cannot, because the wound it commemorates belongs to his body and to his military record. But it also does not restore him to the civic company of honored founders and untroubled heroes. It points toward him and away from him at the same time. That double movement matters because Arnold's life is often told as if it divides neatly into two separate chapters, first the hero, then the traitor. The monument refuses that neat division. The same man who helped the American cause at Saratoga later made secret overtures to British headquarters. The same officer whose left leg was shattered near the Bremen fortified camp later took command of West Point and its dependencies. The same battlefield reputation that made him valuable to the Revolution also made his later betrayal more dangerous, because trust and rank gave him access to power. The public memory problem is not whether Arnold served. He did. It is not whether he betrayed. He did. The problem is that both statements are true, and neither cancels the other as a matter of record. This is where history becomes harder than commemoration. Commemoration often prefers moral clarity. It asks who should be honored, who should be condemned, and where the lines should be drawn in bronze, stone, or landscape. History has to keep the documents in the same room. It has to let Saratoga and West Point belong to the same biography. It has to remember that Arnold's wound at Bemis Heights was real, and that his later attempt to deliver West Point into enemy hands was also real. The Boot Monument is a quiet answer to that difficulty. It does not ask viewers to admire Arnold without reservation. It does not pretend that treason was a footnote. But it also does not permit the battlefield record to be rewritten as if Arnold had never mattered before he became infamous. The form of the memorial makes the contradiction visible by refusing the most expected act of memory, the naming of the person remembered. This unnamed quality is especially powerful because names are central to Arnold's afterlife. In the United States, his name became an epithet. To call someone a Benedict Arnold was to accuse that person of betrayal. The name became less a biography than a warning. It moved beyond the man, beyond the 18th century military record, and entered political and everyday language as shorthand for treachery. But at Saratoga, the monument reverses that process. It remembers the act and suppresses the name. The man whose name became too famous for betrayal becomes, at the site of his service, unnamed. There is a kind of historical irony in that exchange. National memory could not forget him, but Saratoga could not fully say him. His name was everywhere as an accusation, yet absent from the monument that acknowledged one of his clearest services to the American cause. The Boot Monument also directs attention back to the body, not the legend. Arnold's left leg had already been wounded before Saratoga, during the failed assault on Quebec City on December 31, 1775. At Bemis Heights, he was again severely wounded in that leg. The record of his military life is therefore not just a sequence of commands and campaigns. It is also a record of physical risk. He was not merely present in the revolution. He repeatedly placed himself in its violence. That fact made later Americans uncomfortable because courage is not supposed to coexist so easily with betrayal. But it can. That is one of the darker lessons of the Arnold story. Personal bravery does not guarantee public fidelity. Battlefield sacrifice does not prevent political treason. A person can endure hardship for a cause and later turn against it. The archive does not protect us from that contradiction. It preserves it. At Saratoga, the contradiction is fixed in a single symbolic gesture. The boot stands for the wound. The missing name stands for the crime that had not yet happened at Bemis Heights, but would later reshape how the wound could be remembered. The monument therefore looks backward and forward at once. It points backward to October 7, 1777, to the attack near the Bremen fortified camp and the injury that marked Arnold's body. It points forward to the shadow of West Point, where his access to trust, rank, and strategic geography would become the basis of a conspiracy. That forward shadow is important. In 1777, Arnold was still inside the American military story as a hard-driving Continental officer. By 1780, Washington's general orders would state that Arnold, then commanding at West Point, had been about to deliver that important post into enemy hands. Between those two moments lay recovery, reassignment, quarrels, debt, reputation, and the politics of Philadelphia. The Boot Monument does not narrate all of that, but it quietly anticipates the question that will follow him from Saratoga onward. How does a wounded hero become a trusted officer who is willing to betray the trust? The answer does not lie in one monument. It lies in the movement from battlefield fame into the environments where honor, resentment, money, status, and power pressed against one another. After months of recuperation from the Saratoga wound, Arnold was assigned in June 1778 to command Philadelphia. There, at the Penn Mansion on Market Street, later known as the President's House, the story leaves the battlefield and enters a different kind of terrain. The wound remained with him. So did the reputation. But in Philadelphia, reputation would become something to defend, spend, contest, and lose. The terrain after Saratoga was not only physical. Arnold had left the battlefield with a wound that proved his service and limited his movement. The Boot Monument would later solve that contradiction in stone by honoring the injured leg without naming the man. But in the months immediately after Bemis Heights, there was no monument, no settled memory, and no distance from events. There was only an officer recovering from a severe wound, carrying a reputation earned in battle, and entering a city where reputation could become as contested as any redoubt. After months of recuperation from his Saratoga wound, Benedict Arnold was assigned to command Philadelphia in June 1778. The assignment moved him from the open violence of campaigns into the more enclosed struggles of authority, social standing, public suspicion, and money. Philadelphia had been a central place in the Revolutionary crisis. To command there was not the same as commanding a march through the Maine wilderness, or improvising a flotilla on Lake Champlain, or charging near the Bremen fortified camp. It meant administering power in a city where political loyalties, private fortunes, military needs, and personal ambition could meet in close quarters. Arnold's residence in Philadelphia placed him visibly within that world. He lived at the Penn Mansion on Market Street, a building later known as the President's House. The address mattered because it placed him not in a remote military encampment, but in an urban center of status and observation. Market Street was not the Dead River. The Penn Mansion was not a leaking Bateaux or a field headquarters near Bemis Heights. It was a setting where a commander's expenses, visitors, manners, and associations could become part of his public identity. The move also changed the meaning of Arnold's rank. In earlier chapters of his war, rank had been tested in action. At Fort Ticonderoga, at Quebec City, at Valcour Island, and at Saratoga, military authority could be measured against exertion, risk, endurance, and result. In Philadelphia, rank became part of an argument over honor and precedence. The archive record summarized in this episode does not require us to invent Arnold's private thoughts in order to see the environment around him. It is enough to note that quarrels over rank, reputation, debt, and misconduct charges formed part of the atmosphere before the treason. These were not decorative details. They were part of the pressure system around a celebrated officer who would later decide to betray one of the most strategic posts in the American war effort. The change in setting sharpened the central contradiction of Arnold's life. He was not an obscure man slipping unnoticed into conspiracy. He was a Continental officer whose name was already tied to some of the most dramatic episodes of the war. The same man now walking through Philadelphia had helped capture British-held Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen involved. He had led men toward Quebec by way of the Kennebec River and the Maine wilderness. He had been severely wounded in the failed assault on Quebec City. He had constructed a flotilla on Lake Champlain and fought near Valcour Island in a delaying action against British operations from Canada. At Bemis Heights, he had helped direct American attacks against John Burgoyne's forces and had been severely wounded in the left leg near the Bremen fortified camp. That record gave him standing. It also gave him something to defend. Philadelphia made that defense complicated. Public reputation in wartime was fragile, especially for a man living visibly while debts and accusations gathered around him. The research notes place debt and misconduct charges in the same environment as the rank quarrels and reputation disputes. We should be careful with this. Debt was not treason. A misconducted charge was not proof of conspiracy. A quarrel over rank was not the same as a secret message to the enemy. But in a crime and power narrative, these conditions matter because they describe the world in which trust became strained before it was broken. Arnold's Philadelphia period therefore belongs to the story, not because it explains everything, but because it narrows the distance between honor and grievance. The Revolution's military command structure depended on trust. Trust that officers would obey assignments, protect supplies, guard posts, and subordinate private injury to public purpose. Arnold had repeatedly given the cause his body, but Philadelphia placed him inside disputes where service did not settle every question. A hero could still be investigated. A wounded officer could still be criticized. A man with a celebrated battlefield past could still face debt and damage to his name. The misconduct charges would not disappear quickly. The record later shows that a court-martial in 1780 acquitted Arnold of some Philadelphia misconduct charges, but found against him on two matters. Washington's General Orders of April 6, 1780, recorded that Arnold was to receive a reprimand. That outcome belongs later in the timeline, but the roots of it are here, in the Philadelphia Command that began in June 1778. The important point is not to treat the reprimand as the cause of treason. History rarely offers such a clean exchange. The point is that Arnold's years between Saratoga and West Point were marked by conflicts over conduct and esteem, and those conflicts became part of the record before the conspiracy fully emerged. Philadelphia also brought Arnold into a social world that would connect him to Margaret Peggy Shippen. Peggy Shippen was a Philadelphia socialite, and Arnold married her in 1779. Her family had Loyalist connections, a fact that belongs in the record because Loyalist circles and British contacts later become part of the espionage setting around Arnold's secret communications. But the limits of the evidence matter. To say that Peggy Shippen came from a family with Loyalist connections is not the same as proving every later suspicion or assigning her responsibility for Arnold's decisions. The Archive Afghan report approach requires that uncertainty remain uncertainty. It can point to connections without turning them into accusation. Still, her introduction marks a change in the cast of the story. The names surrounding Arnold are no longer only Ethan Allen, Richard Montgomery, Horatio Gates, John Burgoyne, Daniel Morgan, Simon Fraser, Tadeusz Kościuszko, and George Washington. Philadelphia begins to draw in Peggy Shippen, Edward Shippen, Major John André, and Sir Henry Clinton. Some of those names belong to society, some to family, some to British command, and some to the secret correspondence that will follow. Their presence reminds us that espionage does not usually begin as a single dramatic scene. It grows through access, familiarity, opportunity, and motive, moving through ordinary letters, social knowledge, and channels that may look harmless until the pattern is visible. The Penn Mansion on Market Street is important for that reason. It is a location of public command, but also a residence. It is where the official and private worlds could overlap. Arnold's title placed him inside military authority. His debts placed him under financial pressure. His rank disputes and reputation quarrels placed him inside a culture of honor where recognition mattered. His marriage placed him in Philadelphia society. None of these elements alone amounts to treason. Together, they form the ground on which the later crime becomes historically intelligible without becoming excusable. This is where the episode's larger contradiction begins to tighten. Arnold's earlier achievements had been concrete and visible: cannon at Fort Ticonderoga, Bateaux on the Kennebec, the march through wilderness, the failed assault on Quebec City, ships on Lake Champlain, the fighting at Bemis Heights, the wound near the Bremen fortified camp. Philadelphia's evidence is different. It is made of assignments, accusations, social ties, debts, rank, and reputation. It is less dramatic than a battlefield and more dangerous in another way, because it shows a trusted officer living inside the pressures that can make power feel personal. By 1779, the world around Arnold had changed again. He had married Peggy Shippen. The Philadelphia disputes had not vanished. His public standing remained tangled in questions of honor and conduct. And according to Encyclopedia Britannica, in May 1779, Arnold made secret overtures to British headquarters. From that point, the story begins to move from quarrel and grievance into espionage, invisible ink, coded writing, ordinary-looking letters, and the careful use of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England as a codebook. The battlefield hero had entered the city with a wounded leg and a famous name. Before long, that name would begin traveling through secret lines. By the time Arnold's name began moving through secret lines, the story had already left the visible world of military appointment and public dispute. Philadelphia had given him office, society, accusation, and marriage. It had also placed him near Loyalist connections at a moment when private relationships and political allegiance could overlap in dangerous ways. The archive does not require us to invent a single dramatic meeting in a candlelit room. The confirmed record is already stark enough. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, in May 1779, Benedict Arnold made secret overtures to British headquarters. That phrase, secret overtures, marks a change in the kind of evidence we are following. Earlier, Arnold's record could be traced through routes, battles, wounds, and commands: Fort Ticonderoga, the Kennebec River, Quebec City, Lake Champlain, Bemis Heights, Philadelphia. Now the trail narrows. It enters correspondence. It enters coded language. It enters the hidden space between lines on a page. The British headquarters to which Arnold reached out belonged to the enemy he had fought since the opening of the war. At the center of that British command world stood Sir Henry Clinton. Within Clinton's circle was Major John André, the officer who would become Arnold's principal contact in the espionage story. André's name belongs here, not because of legend, but because the mechanics of the plot would run through him: letters, codes, invisible ink, and the careful handling of information that could not be spoken openly. This is where Arnold's treason begins to look less like a single impulse and more like a system. Espionage in the Revolutionary War depended on routes of communication, trusted intermediaries, ordinary paper, and extraordinary caution. The notes preserved around Arnold and André show a method built to hide danger in plain sight. Their communications used invisible ink and coded writing embedded between the lines of ordinary-looking letters. A reader without the key might see a harmless message. A reader with the right method and the right book could find another message concealed beneath it. The book was Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. That detail is small, almost dry, but it matters. A codebook turns printed authority into secret machinery. Blackstone's commentaries was not a battlefield object like a cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, or a bateau on the Kennebec, or a chain across the Hudson River. It was a legal text, a work associated with English law and learned a reference. In the Arnold-André correspondence, according to the research notes, it served as part of the hidden architecture of communication. The law book became a key for messages moving through a war over sovereignty, loyalty, and power. There is a quiet irony in that. Arnold had spent years fighting under the Continental cause, a cause defined against British authority. Now, in secret, a landmark of English legal commentary helped structure his communication with British officers. The point is not to force symbolism onto the archive. The point is that espionage often uses ordinary materials because ordinary materials attract less attention. A letter could look like a letter. Lines of writing could appear routine. A book could sit on a shelf as a book. Yet together, paper, ink, spacing, and code could carry treason. Invisible ink added another layer. It made the physical page deceptive. What appeared blank, or merely ordinary, could hold a second text. The hidden message was not separate from the visible one. It lived inside the same object. That is part of what makes this phase of Arnold's story so unnerving. His public identity and secret conduct were not placed in different worlds. They occupied the same life. He was still Benedict Arnold, the wounded officer of Saratoga, the man whose service had been real. At the same time, his name and intentions were moving toward British headquarters through concealed channels. Major John André now enters the narrative as more than a name attached to the later collapse of the plot. He was the British officer connected to Arnold's secret exchanges. He stood within the British military world under Sir Henry Clinton, and he became the person through whom Arnold's hidden communications passed. The record supplied here does not require us to describe André beyond those supported functions. His importance lies in his position. He was the British contact whose role turned Arnold's dissatisfaction into an operational relationship. Around that relationship stood the wider world of Loyalist contact. Philadelphia had already introduced Peggy Shippen, whom Arnold married in 1779 and whose family had Loyalist connections. Those connections should be handled carefully. They belong to the setting, not to an unsupported accusation. They help explain the social and political environment through which information, sympathy, acquaintance, and access could move. In a divided revolutionary city, public loyalty and private association were not always cleanly separated. People knew people across lines. Families had histories. Officers had social circles. Political identities entered rooms before anyone wrote a letter. For Arnold, this world mattered because treason requires contact. A grievance alone does not open a channel to the enemy. Debt, rank disputes, reputation, and anger may help explain the pressure around a man, but they do not by themselves create a working line to British command. The May 1779 overtures are therefore a turning point. They show Arnold no longer merely resentful, no longer only defending himself against accusations, no longer only navigating Philadelphia's uneasy politics. He had begun reaching outward toward the opposing army. The form of the communication also tells us something about the risk. Coded writing embedded between the lines of ordinary-looking letters was not casual correspondence. Invisible ink was not the tool of an officer with nothing to hide. The use of Blackstone's commentaries as a codebook meant that both sides needed a shared structure for meaning. This was not a shouted offer across a battlefield. It was a negotiated secrecy, a language built so that discovery could be resisted. At this stage, the full West Point plot had not yet taken its final shape in the record we are following. Arnold had not yet taken command of that post and its dependencies. He had not yet been positioned over the defenses guarding the Hudson River, but the invisible line was already being drawn. The later attempt to surrender West Point would depend on trust from the American side and communication with the British side. In May 1779, the communication side was beginning. This is why the espionage chapter cannot be separated from the earlier chapters of battlefield service. The shock of Arnold's betrayal came from the distance between the visible record and the hidden one. The same man who had helped capture British-held Fort Ticonderoga had now made secret overtures to British headquarters. The same man who had led men through the Maine wilderness, who had been wounded at Quebec City, who had delayed British operations from Canada at Valcour Island, and who had been severely wounded in the left leg near the Bremen fortified camp at Bemis Heights, was now entering correspondence with the enemy. The contradiction is not a later invention. It is built into the archive. And yet the documents also caution against making the story too theatrical too early. Espionage is often quiet before it becomes visible. A coded exchange does not sound like cannon fire. Invisible ink does not look like an army on the march. But these methods can prepare the way for decisions as consequential as any battle order. In Arnold's case, the hidden communications form the beginning of a path that would eventually lead to West Point, to Major André's capture, and to Washington's general orders describing a post nearly delivered into enemy hands. For now, the evidence gives us the first concealed motion. May 1779, secret overtures to British headquarters, exchanges with Major John André, invisible ink, coded writing between the lines of ordinary letters, Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England used as a codebook, the presence of Sir Henry Clinton's British command world, and the surrounding atmosphere of Loyalist connections. The mechanics matter because they strip away the idea that treason began only in a dramatic final act. Before the attempted surrender of a strategic post, there was contact. Before the documents carried near Tarrytown, there were hidden messages. Before Arnold escaped to a British ship, there was a page that could say one thing openly and another thing secretly. At the same time, Arnold's public troubles had not disappeared. The Philadelphia charges still belonged to the record. His standing within the American army remained under pressure. In 1780, a court-martial would acquit him of some misconduct charges, but find against him on two matters. Washington's General Orders of April 6, 1780, would record that Arnold was to receive a reprimand. By then, the secret correspondence had already begun. The visible reprimand and the invisible ink would soon belong to the same tightening story, a wounded hero, still inside the American command structure, moving closer to the post where betrayal could become action. The visible reprimand and the invisible ink now begin to occupy the same frame. On one side was the official Army record, charges, findings, orders, and the authority of George Washington. On the other side was the hidden channel, already opened toward British headquarters, where ordinary-looking letters could carry another meaning between the lines. For Benedict Arnold, these were not separate worlds. They overlapped in the narrow months before West Point. The court-martial of 1780 did not simply erase the Philadelphia accusations, and it did not destroy Arnold outright. That is part of what makes the episode so important. The proceeding acquitted him of some misconduct charges connected to his time in Philadelphia, but it found against him on two matters. In the language of military institutions, that distinction mattered. An acquittal on some points left room for defense. A finding against him on others left a mark. Arnold had survived wounds, marches, river campaigns, and battlefield controversy. He had also survived disputes over rank and reputation. But a court-martial was different from gossip, different from resentment, and different from the private calculations of debt or ambition. It placed his conduct inside a formal archive. It made judgment part of the Army's own paper trail. That paper trail reached Washington's headquarters. In General Orders of April 6, 1780, Washington recorded that Arnold was to receive a reprimand. The entry is brief in comparison with the scale of Arnold's earlier service. It does not retell Fort Ticonderoga. It does not retrace the Kennebec River or the Maine wilderness. It does not pause at Quebec City, Valcour Island, or Bemis Heights. But precisely because it is an order, it carries the weight of command. The Army was not merely remembering Arnold as a wounded hero. It was disciplining him as an officer. For a man whose revolutionary identity had been built in public acts of exertion, this was a severe transformation. Earlier records had attached Arnold's name to motion, moving toward Fort Ticonderoga, moving men and boats through the wilderness toward Quebec, building a flotilla on Lake Champlain, moving into the violence near the Bremen fortified camp at Saratoga. The reprimand attached his name to another kind of movement, downward, inward, toward grievance, toward secrecy, toward a military post where command would become opportunity. The language of reprimand also exposes the uneasy balance inside the American cause. The Continental Army needed experienced officers. Arnold was not an obscure man who could be dismissed from memory without consequence. His service was real. His injuries were real. His earlier usefulness to the American war effort was real. That made discipline more complicated, not less. A reprimand of Benedict Arnold was a reprimand of a major figure in the war, a man whose left leg had been shattered in the fighting at Bemis Heights, and whose name still carried the history of hard campaigns. The archive does not require us to invent his private thoughts in order to see the pressure of the moment. It is enough to place the documents beside one another. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, in May 1779, Arnold had already made secret overtures to British headquarters. His communications with Major John André used invisible ink and coded writing embedded between the lines of ordinary-looking letters. Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England served as a code book. Then, in 1780, the court-martial record reached its result. Some charges were not sustained. Two matters went against him. Washington's General Orders of April 6th recorded the reprimand. One channel was hidden. The other was official. Together, they show a man still inside the Continental Army, but no longer simply aligned with it. That is the crucial bridge. The court-martial did not come after the treason plot had fully unfolded. It came before Arnold took command of West Point and its dependencies. It stands between the Philadelphia troubles and the Hudson River conspiracy. It belongs to the phase when Arnold was still able to receive orders, still able to hold rank, still able to be entrusted, and still able to turn that trust into danger. Philadelphia had already changed the atmosphere around him. He had arrived there in June 1778, after months of recuperation from Saratoga. He lived at the Penn Mansion on Market Street, later known as the President's House. He entered a world of rank disputes, social connections, accusations, and reputation under strain. In 1779, he married Margaret Peggy Shippen, a Philadelphia socialite from a family with Loyalist connections. None of these facts alone explains treason, but together they form the documented setting in which Arnold's public identity and private direction began to diverge. The reprimand sharpened that divergence. It was public enough to matter within the army, formal enough to be preserved in general orders, and limited enough that Arnold remained useful. The American command did not cast him out. It marked him and retained him. That combination would prove dangerous. A disgraced outsider could not surrender West Point. A trusted officer could. The word reprimand can sound mild from a distance. It does not have the violence of a battlefield wound or the drama of a captured spy. But in an officer's world, honor and command were not abstractions. They were the working currency of authority. A reprimand from Washington's army placed Arnold's conduct under official censure at the very moment when his secret correspondence was already moving toward the enemy. The insult was not merely personal, it was institutional. The army he had served, the army in which he had sought recognition, had now placed a formal stain beside his name. Yet the record also resists a simple story of sudden rupture. Arnold was not reprimanded and then instantly transformed into a traitor. The secret overtures had already begun. The hidden communications were already part of the story. The court-martial and reprimand did not create the treason from nothing. They help explain the dangerous condition of the man who would soon be trusted with one of the most important posts in the war. This is why the date matters. April 6, 1780, sits only months before August 3, 1780, when Arnold took command of West Point and its dependencies, according to the American Battlefield Trust account of the plot. Between those dates, the American army still had to assign officers, guard strategic ground, and manage a war whose geography could decide political survival. Arnold, despite accusation and reprimand, remained inside that structure. The case also shows the limits of an archive built from official papers. General orders can tell us that a reprimand was to be given. A court-martial record can tell us that some charges failed and 2 findings stood. Espionage evidence can tell us about invisible ink, coded writing, and Blackstone's commentaries as a codebook. But the archive cannot reduce Arnold to one clean motive. It gives us a sequence instead. Fame, injury, dispute, secret contact, court judgment, reprimand, and then command at West Point. That sequence is more unsettling than a simple explanation. It means that the treason plot grew not outside American power, but through it. Arnold's access came from his rank. His credibility came from his service. His opportunity came from trust that had not yet entirely collapsed. The reprimand did not remove him from the army's inner machinery. It left him close enough to use it. By the spring of 1780, the distance between public service and private betrayal had narrowed up. Washington's general orders placed Arnold under censure. British correspondents offered another path. The man once marked by battlefield wounds was now marked also by official rebuke. Still, he remained a Continental officer. Still, he could be assigned a command. Still, he could stand at the edge of the Hudson Highlands with authority over defenses that mattered to the entire American war effort. Soon the story would leave the hearing room and the written reprimand behind. It would move north to West Point, to the hard bend of the Hudson River, to forts, batteries, redoubts, Constitution Island, and the great chain stretched across the water. The reprimanded officer was not finished. He was about to be placed at the center of the map. The story now moves from paper to terrain. The reprimand belonged to the official record, and the secret correspondence belonged to the hidden world of espionage. But West Point belonged to the map. It was not an abstract command, not merely another posting for an officer whose reputation had been damaged, but not destroyed. It was a military system built into one of the most important river corridors of the Revolutionary War. According to the American Battlefield Trust account of the plot, Benedict Arnold took command of West Point and its dependencies on August 3, 1780. That date matters because it placed him, formally and visibly, over the very post that would soon define his treason. Arnold was not outside the American army, looking in. He was inside its structure, entrusted with a command whose value was understood by both sides. West Point mattered because of the Hudson River. In the Revolutionary War, the Hudson was more than a waterway. It was a line of movement through the Hudson Highlands, a route that could help connect or divide regions of the rebellion. Control of the river carried the possibility of separating New England from the other rebellious colonies. To threaten West Point was therefore to threaten a strategic joint in the American war effort. The geography itself gave West Point its power. The post guarded a sharp S-curve in the Hudson River, a difficult bend where current, wind, and channel all worked against easy navigation. Ships did not simply glide through that part of the river as if crossing open water. The river turned. The wind shifted. The current complicated movement. In a war of sailing vessels, artillery positions, and river obstacles, such details were not decorative. They were military facts. A commander who held West Point held ground that could slow, expose, and block an enemy trying to move through the highlands. The landscape helped the defenders. The river's bend made vessels vulnerable. The heights gave places for guns. The narrowness of the passage made a barrier across the water more plausible than it would have been in a broad, open reach. The site was a defensive design made out of stone, timber, iron, earth, water, and topography. The defenses under Arnold's authority included Fort Arnold, Fort Putnam, Fort Constitution on Constitution Island, batteries, redoubts, and the Great Chain stretched across the Hudson River. Each name belongs to the infrastructure of the plot. Arnold was not offering the British a single gate or a lonely fort. He was in command of a network of positions meant to work together. Fort Arnold stood at the center of this system. Its name, at that moment, still carried Arnold's own. The American Battlefield Trust summarizes its armament with a set of guns and mortars that help us see the post as a practical military installation rather than a symbol alone. 1 24-pounder, 6 18-pounders, 1 12-pounder, 1 4-pounder, 3 3-pounders, and 11 mortars. Those pieces represented more than inventory. They were the metal voice of the fort, the tools by which a bend in the river became a defended passage. Fort Putnam added another layer. It was a stone fortification, built with features intended to endure fire and sustain men inside a fortified position, casemates, bomb-proofs, a provision magazine, and artillery. Its guns included 18-pounders, 12-pounders, 6-pounders, a 4-pounder, and 5 1/2-inch mortars. Here, again, the physical vocabulary matters. Casemates, bomb-proofs, magazines, and mortars are the language of military engineering. West Point was not only a place where soldiers stood watch. It was a constructed defensive system. Across the river landscape lay Constitution Island, with Fort Constitution. The island was part of the guarded Hudson Passage, and its place in the defensive geography helped bind the river, the shore, and the fortifications into one larger design. Batteries and redoubts extended that design. They gave the defenses depth and angles. They made the post harder to reduce to a single target. And then there was the Great Chain. The Great Chain is one of those archive objects that can sound almost legendary until the measurements bring it back into the world of labor and material. The American Battlefield Trust describes each link as about 2 feet long and weighing 114 pounds. The total span was about 600 yards, with a total weight of about 65 tons. The Museum of the American Revolution describes a 500-yard chain, also about 65 tons. The figures differ in span, but they agree on the essential point. This was an enormous iron obstacle, built to turn the Hudson itself into part of the fortification. The chain was stretched across the river, not as a decoration, but as a barrier. It was meant to obstruct enemy shipping moving through the highlands. To imagine it properly, it helps to slow down the picture. Link by link, iron was made into a line across a strategic waterway. That line had to float, hold, be anchored, and be defended. It had to exist in weather, current, and war. It was not enough to forge it. It had to be placed where the river's geography made it useful and where nearby defenses could protect it. The Great Chain made visible the central idea of West Point. The post was not simply guarding land beside a river. It was using the river as part of the defense. The bend slowed ships. The heights positioned guns. The forts sheltered men and artillery. The batteries and redoubts multiplied the danger to any attacking force. The chain placed a physical obstruction across the route itself. This is why Arnold's command mattered so much. His treason was not the betrayal of a minor outpost. It was the attempted transfer of a designed defensive system. If West Point and its dependencies could be delivered into British hands, the consequences would reach beyond the immediate loss of fortifications. The British would gain a strategic position on the Hudson, and the American effort to hold the river corridor would be gravely weakened. The phrase West Point and its dependencies is important for that reason. It tells us that Arnold's authority was broader than a single fort. It included connected works and positions whose strength lay partly in their relationship to one another. A battery without the larger system was one thing. A chain without protected banks was another. But together, forts, redoubts, artillery, island, river bend, and iron obstruction formed a military machine. By August 3, 1780, Arnold was placed inside that machine as commander. This is the quiet terror of the episode. The earlier chapters gave him as a man of movement, from New Haven to Fort Ticonderoga, through the Maine wilderness toward Quebec, across Lake Champlain at Valcour Island, into the fighting at Saratoga, and then into Philadelphia's disputed politics. At West Point, movement slowed into possession. He held a post. He had authority over defenses. He could know their weaknesses, their arrangements, their armament, and their dependencies. For the British, such knowledge had obvious value. For the Americans, such trust was necessary and dangerous. Armies depend on command. Fortifications depend on the loyalty of the officers who hold them. A wall can resist cannon, but it cannot resist a commander who decides to open the way. A chain can obstruct ships, but it cannot defend itself against betrayal from within the system built to protect it. This is where the crime and power story becomes clearest. Arnold's power came from service already rendered, and from rank still recognized. He had not been an obscure conspirator at the edge of events. He had been a celebrated Continental officer, wounded in American service, entrusted with important responsibilities even after controversy and reprimand. That trust brought him to West Point. Once there, the same authority that made him useful to the American cause also made his betrayal potentially catastrophic. The archive gives us the shape of what he controlled: Fort Arnold, Fort Putnam, Fort Constitution, Constitution Island, batteries, redoubts, and the Great Chain across the Hudson. It gives us the strategic reason: the river's S-curve, the difficult currents, the winds, the bend, and the larger importance of the Hudson corridor. It gives us the date he assumed command, August 3, 1780. These details are not background scenery. They are the mechanics of the plot. To surrender West Point would have meant more than lowering a flag. It would have meant handing over a river defense built from geography and iron. It would have meant yielding guns, works, positions, and information. It would have meant turning a trusted command into a weapon against the army that had assigned it. For a time, the system still appeared intact. The forts stood. The batteries faced the river. The redoubts held their places. Constitution Island remained part of the defensive landscape. The Great Chain lay across the Hudson as an enormous sign of American determination to block British passage. And Benedict Arnold, whose name had once been attached to boldness, endurance, and wounds suffered in battle, stood at the center of it. But the chain across the water could not stop a packet of papers moving over land. The forts could not read the intentions of the officer who commanded them. The bend in the Hudson could slow ships, but it could not slow the hidden correspondence that had already drawn Arnold toward British headquarters. Soon the plot would no longer be contained in invisible ink, coded lines, or military geography. It would be carried on a man's person toward British lines, with documents tied to West Point. And when that movement was interrupted, the great design Arnold hoped to sell would be exposed. The packet of papers did what the Great Chain was built to prevent in another form. It moved past the great defensive system at West Point, away from the forts, batteries, redoubts, and river obstacles, and toward British lines. It did not travel as an army. It did not come down the Hudson as a ship trying to force the bend. It was carried by Major John André, the British officer who had become central to the final stage of Benedict Arnold's secret arrangement. In the records of the collapse, this is where the conspiracy becomes suddenly visible. For months, Arnold's treason had belonged to hidden channels, invisible ink, coded writing, ordinary-looking letters, and a codebook drawn from Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. At West Point, the hidden design had taken on military value. Arnold was not merely communicating with the enemy. He was in command of one of the most important American posts on the Hudson River, and he was preparing to hand that post over. But espionage depends on movement, and movement creates risk. André was captured while returning toward British lines with documents related to West Point. The area associated with his capture was near Tarrytown, New York, where American militiamen stopped him. The papers he carried connected him to the military system Arnold commanded, the post, its dependencies, and the defenses that stood at the Hudson Highlands. In that moment, the carefully managed distance between secret correspondence and public proof disappeared. The plot had always required two worlds to remain separate. In one world, Benedict Arnold was still an American major general, entrusted with West Point and its dependencies after taking command on August 3, 1780. In the other, he was bargaining with British power over the future of that same post. André's capture joined those worlds together. What had been invisible became documentary. What had been suspected only by those inside the secret channel became a matter for Army orders, interrogation, and judgment. George Washington's General Orders of September 26, 1780, placed the betrayal into the official language of the Continental Army. The orders stated that Arnold, then commanding at West Point, had been about to deliver that important post into enemy hands. They also stated that Major John André was a prisoner. The wording is stark because it is administrative. It does not need theatrical language. It names the command, the intention, and the captured officer. West Point was not described as a minor station or an interchangeable fort. It was that important post. The phrase matters. It reminds us that Arnold's intended betrayal was not symbolic only. It was strategic. To surrender West Point was to endanger the Hudson River line, the Highlands, and a defensive system built to complicate British movement through the region. The same orders also revealed the imbalance at the heart of the ending. André was a prisoner. Arnold was not. When the plot broke open, Arnold escaped to a British ship. The man who had once moved through the Maine wilderness toward Quebec, who had fought on Lake Champlain, who had been wounded at Quebec City and again in the left leg near the Bremen fortified camp at Bemis Heights, now fled the army he had served. His escape ensured that the legal consequences of the exposed conspiracy would fall most immediately on André, not on Arnold himself. André's case became one of the sharpest episodes in the Revolutionary War's world of espionage. He was a British officer, but he had been captured while returning toward British lines with concealed or incriminating materials related to West Point. The legal distinction between soldier and spy mattered. Uniform, disguise, route, documents, and mission all shaped the outcome. In October 1780, Major John André was hanged as a spy. The execution did not erase the central fact that Arnold had escaped. It sharpened it. André died under American authority, while Arnold crossed into British protection and continued his life on the other side of the war. The intended sale of West Point had failed, but the defection itself had succeeded. Arnold had changed armies. After his defection, Benedict Arnold served in the British Army. That service included a later act that carried the war back toward the geography of his own beginnings. In September 1781, he led a British attack on New London, Connecticut. The detail is difficult to pass over quietly because Connecticut had been the place of his birth and early public life. He had been born in Norwich, Connecticut, and before the Revolution, he had been a successful businessman and militia captain in New Haven. In the final phase of the war, after becoming the most notorious defector in the American cause, he returned not as a Continental officer, not as the ambitious militia captain of earlier years, but in British service. The full contradiction of Arnold's life is not that a villain had once pretended to be useful. The record is more troubling than that. His earlier service had been real. Fort Ticonderoga had brought badly needed cannon into American hands. The march toward Quebec had carried roughly 1,100 Continental soldiers across more than 300 miles of wilderness by way of the Kennebec River and the Maine interior. The failed assault on Quebec City had left Richard Montgomery dead and Arnold severely wounded. At Valcour Island, Arnold's improvised naval resistance helped delay British operations from Canada. At Bemis Heights, his aggressive action contributed to the American victory at Saratoga, where he was again severely wounded, this time in the left leg near the Bremen fortified camp. Those facts did not cancel his treason. They made it harder to contain. A lesser officer's betrayal might have remained a grim footnote. Arnold's became a national emblem because he had once been trusted, celebrated, and materially important to the American war effort. The crime came from inside the circle of confidence. He was not an obscure courier. He was the commander of West Point. He was not merely passing rumors. He was positioned to deliver a fortified Hudson River post, with its chain, forts, batteries, redoubts, and dependencies, into British hands. That is why his name endured differently from André's. John André remained, in memory, the captured British officer at the center of the exposed plot. Benedict Arnold became something larger and colder in American speech, a name used to mean betrayal itself. Over time, to call someone a Benedict Arnold was not to make a detailed argument about West Point, Invisible Ink, or the Hudson Highlands. It was to compress the entire episode into a moral accusation. And yet the archive resists compression. It leaves us with George Washington's orders, with André's capture, with the documents related to West Point, with the hanging in October 1780, with Arnold's escape to a British ship, with his later British service, and with the attack on New London. It also leaves us with the earlier battle record: Ticonderoga, Quebec, Valcour Island, Saratoga. The same file contains endurance and ambition, wounds and resentment, command and conspiracy. Benedict Arnold died in London on June 14, 1801. By then, the American Revolution had long since moved from active war into national memory. In that memory, Arnold's battlefield achievements could not be fully denied, but they could not be comfortably honored in the usual way. The National Park Service's Boot Monument at Saratoga captures that discomfort better than any simple verdict. It commemorates the wounded leg of a soldier who fought for the American cause at Saratoga, but it does not name him. An unnamed boot is a strange memorial. It acknowledges the wound while withholding the name. It preserves the service while refusing the honor that a name would confer. It is not forgetfulness. It is judgment in stone. That is where the story finally settles, not in a clean division between hero and traitor, but in the uneasy fact that both descriptions belong to the same man at different moments in the same war. Benedict Arnold helped win glory for the American cause, then tried to sell one of its most strategic posts to the enemy. He left behind a record too substantial to erase and a betrayal too great to forgive. The chain across the Hudson did its work against ships. The forts at West Point remained part of the American defense. André was captured, tried by the logic of wartime espionage, and hanged. Arnold escaped, but his name did not escape with him. It remained behind in the country he abandoned, hardened by memory into an epithet, while at Saratoga a nameless boot continued to mark the wound of the hero who became America's most famous traitor.